Okay, we are studying in the book of Daniel this evening. We left on a cliffhanger last week. Okay, Daniel got put in the lion's den. Is he going to survive? Okay, tune back in next week. This is next week. We have a chance to find out how Daniel did as he was tossed into the lion's den for obeying God. Just a quick catch up if you weren't with us last week or if you forgot the story. It's a very familiar story, but just a reminder. The people that did not like Daniel because he had so much favor with the king, and Darius was under Cyrus, who was you might call him the emperor, and then Darius was the king of the Babylonian territories. And Darius was about to make Daniel second in command to him in the Babylonian territories. And it made all of the other people, there had been 3 provincial administrators, and there were a whole bunch of under them, there were a whole bunch of other provincial people. And so they were jealous. There were 120 satraps and the commissioners or the administrators, and above them, 3 of them, and Daniel was about to get over everyone. And so they said, how can we get this guy? And last week we studied that Daniel had such a wonderful integrity that they could find nothing that he had done wrong. And so they thought, the only way we're going to get this guy is if we get him for his faith. And that was how they set the trap. They appealed to Darius's ego. They lied to him. They came to him and they said, hey, all of us administrators and all of the satraps agree that we need to do a loyalty test. And the loyalty test is simply this: for 30 days, no one will pray or ask any deity for anything. They need to only ask you for the next 30 days. So they lied to him immediately, just right point blank. They lied to him because Daniel, they said, by saying what they said, they were saying Daniel agreed with them. If they'd said Daniel doesn't agree, it wouldn't have happened. And so Darius went, okay, well, if Daniel agrees, it must be fine. Yeah, everyone's saying this is great. And then they had him do it according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, so that no one, not even Darius, could change it. And it was only after the decree went out, Daniel saw it, and Daniel did his little bit of civil disobedience. He would always get out at his window, and he would kneel down and pray 3 times a day facing Jerusalem. And he did not allow this decree to hinder him from doing his worship of his God. And so as a result, the trap was sprung. They dragged him before the king. Darius was horrified that it was Daniel, understood that he was a godly man, understood the trap, but there was nothing he could do because it was according to the law of the Medes and the Persians. And so at evening time, by the end of the day, he had to have Daniel in the lion's den. But he prophesied to Daniel, your God is going to save you. Now, if that was a prayer, it was a statement, but it was his prayer, obviously. We find out he didn't quite have the confidence that he sounded like he had because of what happened next. And so we are at the point where Daniel has been put in the lion's den. The king's signet ring was used to seal it, but also the other nobility's signet ring so that the king couldn't go around them. That would be the fact that they wanted their signet rings on that stone means they didn't trust the king. And it was a very clear message to the king. This is not how you win friends and influence political enemies or people. You make political enemies doing what they had done. And when you're dealing with someone that's got a lot of power, that's a dangerous thing to do. So anyway, tonight we are looking at Daniel as he is spending the night in the lion's den. I've entitled tonight's message, Trusting God in the Lion's Den. So, trusting God in the lion's den. We are in Daniel chapter 6, verses 18 to 28. So, the king goes back to his palace. He says, God's going to help you. in verse 18, then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. Now, this is a picture of an oriental monarch that just didn't happen. These guys partied. Belshazzar was showing us how you could party. You had the Medes and the Persians camped around the city of Babylon, and they're having a major party throughout the city. It didn't bother them that there were people outside the walls. Those people were outside the walls. They're not getting inside the walls. And so they had a major drunk fest, and so much so that they insulted God, and we had the writing on the wall and all of that sort of stuff, and Belshazzar lost his kingdom that night. But these guys knew how to feast. If you were a part of the king's table, you ate well. And they knew how to drink. And they knew how to be entertained. There'd be music. There'd be all sorts of stuff. And so the fact that he goes back to the castle and he just simply says, none of that for me tonight. He doesn't eat. He doesn't drink any alcohol. He has no entertainment, and the word entertainment is a broad word, any distractions. And there were a lot of distractions that could entertain an oriental monarch, and none of that. And then he couldn't sleep. He tries to sleep. When it says sleep fled his eyes, it means he tried to sleep, and he was unable to sleep. He tossed and turned all night. He had to be crying out to Daniel's God to preserve him. I can't even imagine what it must have been like for Daniel as for the king, as he's praying for Daniel, and he's thinking, these were my orders. I was tricked, and now it may cost the guy I want to make second in command, my most trusted advisor, the man I trust most in all the kingdom. My orders may now kill him. That'd be difficult, to put it mildly. So we have the king obviously concerned. He's so stirred up. He gets right up at sunrise to be able to go out there. Probably had something to do with their laws that he had to be out there for a whole night or whatever. In case the lions wanted to come back for seconds, I don't know. And so the king heads out to the lion's den. It sounds like he was running on the way out there. He went in haste to the lion's den, got on a horse, got on a chariot, went out there as quickly as he could. I have no idea where the lion's den was, but it wasn't anywhere within smelling distance of the castle. So you didn't want that aroma from dead meat coming, disturbing you when there was, carry-on that the lions were fed. So, okay. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Pregnant pause. The king is excited. He's calling out in advance. There's guards around the stone. And so they've probably already got the orders to be moving the stone away so that he'd be able to hear Daniel. He begins shouting as he approaches, Daniel, has your God been able to save you? And listen what he calls Daniel. You're a servant of the living God. That's pretty important. If you think about it, he served dead idols. The idols that he had were dead idols. And so now he's the servant of the living God. Very interesting that he confessed that Daniel's God was the living God. And so the only question he had really is, was your God able? And that was his question. Was your God able? What am I going to find? Was your God able? Hope against hope. Verse 21. Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king. I have committed no crime. I can't imagine when the king heard his voice. He probably wept. He was excited. There was an angelic intervention. Last week I talked about when you've got a whole bunch of lions who aren't interested in you as a meal, and their natural aggressiveness has been gotten rid of, they're like the perfect pillows. He probably had a much better night's sleep than the king. Because if you've got some supernaturally pacified lions, there's a pretty good chance that Daniel had a very good night's rest. That's kind of my envisioning of this. And they might have been smelly, I don't know, but hey, they would have been smelly wherever you were in a lion's den. So, and there was certainly an angelic intervention. It was like the blue angels had flown in, and they had taken care of Daniel, and they shut the lion's mouth. And that means the lion's hunger was abated, their normal fierceness was abated. Because, if they're not hungry, they can still bat you one just for fun. I mean, these are wild animals. That's why you don't keep wild animals around. They may not be hungry because you keep them well fed, but one day they're just kind of, let's play. And your arm's gashed open or shoulders broken or, worse. So, because they're so powerful. And that was the king's concern. How is he going to survive the night, even if they're not hungry? Now, by the way, they kept them hungry because they needed them to execute their prisoners. So Daniel says, no, God sent an angel. I'm fine. I was innocent before him. I was innocent before you, king. I've been completely innocent before God and you. And so God protected me. So he had committed no crime. Now, I think if you're about to get tossed into a lion's den, it's a pretty good thing to have short accounts with God. I think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before they went into the fire. They obviously had short accounts before God. They knew they weren't perfect. They understood the sacrificial system that they came out of, as well as we understand the cross, meaning that there has to be the shedding of blood for sin to be forgiven, because sin has to be dealt with, and we all know we all fall short of the glory of God. We fall short of his perfection. Jesus says in the Beatitudes, be perfect even, not in the Beatitudes, but as in the Sermon on the Mount, be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And that's a tall order. We like to compare ourselves to each other, and you look and you say, well, someone's, when you compare to human beings, here's the best human being, and here's the worst human being as far as the spread between them. And then God is like, we're, way, way, way up there as far as anything that we can approach, because we have built-in imperfection. We hurt people without even trying. It's our insensitivities and sometimes we're just crabby and we've drank too much coffee, or we drank too little coffee, or we didn't get enough sleep, and that thing on the inside, it's like the filters, the stuff that kind of makes sure that we're buffered to the world can disappear because we're irritated. If you've ever fasted for longer than a day or two, it's like you can just feel the buffering mechanisms that keep your personality pleasant just kind of all starts to fritter away. And you realize, I'm coming to find out who I really am, because there's no food or distractions that are getting in the way of who I am. And so you can get very blunt very quickly because of the fact that you don't have the normal comfort things that are built into our lives. And then you just have this whole different thing happening. That reminds, I think it's good for us to fast once in a while, because you can find out just how short your fuse really is without things that comfort you, that entertain you, which food entertains too, because it's tasty, it's nice, it's okay. And then just the whole idea of not having the energy supplies that you normally have, or the way, it reminds us what's really on the inside of us and how much we need God's grace. By the way, there's the picture, by the way. And the picture is we need his food. Like spiritual babes crave pure spiritual milk. Chew on the food of the word. Because why? Because if you start fasting the word, your unloveliness on the inside is going to come out. And if you fast food, don't eat fast food. That's not what I'm saying. If you don't eat food, you find out very quickly what's on the inside of you. And at first, especially when you have a lot more strength and ability, you can just get very irritable, etc. And I mean, if you go through caffeine withdrawal and all that stuff. But we find out what's really on the inside. And so when Daniel says that he's innocent, he doesn't mean that he's a perfect person. He just means, I have tried not to live in a way that offends the majesty of God, and I've tried to live in a way that's not a crime against you, O King. And that's a wonderful statement. It's nice to be able to say, I don't have anything on my conscience right now other than the normal stuff that gets our feet dirty. That's a picture when Jesus went around and wanted to wash the disciples' feet, and he was going around the room washing their feet, and the dead silence in the room was growing deeper and deeper, because this was awful to have Jesus. None of them wanted to wash each other's feet because that would have been condescending. They were all concerned about who was the greatest. And so Jesus gets up and starts to wash their feet, and that must have been the most horrifying thing that could have happened. And then he gets to Peter, and Peter says, Lord, you're never going to wash my feet. The cheekiness of that. Saying to Jesus, no. And Jesus said, well, if you don't want me to wash your feet, you have no part with me. Jesus had a way of saying things, right? Think about it. Peter's going, no, you're never going to wash my feet. And Jesus just says, okay, it's up to you. You just will have nothing to do with me in the future. Turns to move on. Can you imagine if he looked like he was picking up his water basin to walk away? Which he could have been. Because it was the next words. If Peter wasn't quick with his words and saying, oops, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, Jesus might have moved on. Now, of course, he was setting Peter up, but, you don't fool around with the God of the universe, right? You just don't. And so Peter says, oh, Jesus, he says, not just my feet, then my everything, my head and my hands, because now he's going to dive in, right? Jesus, you can pour that whole thing right over me. And because it would have cooled off his humiliation probably. But Jesus said, no, if you've had a bath, and you have, because you're a part of me, if you've had a bath, you don't need, you just got to get your feet washed, because you pick up stuff along the way. You walk through your day, and there's stuff that you stumble into that you don't even intend to stumble into. You just, all of a sudden, you find yourself upset with someone, and you say something unkind, and you do this, or there's a temptation that jumps up in front of you, and you stumble toward it. You go, oh, no, but you got halfway into it. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that we stumble until we catch ourselves. And you get to the end of the day, and you just say, Lord, forgive me for everything that I've done today. That's washing your feet. And Daniel was well aware of that. He wasn't talking about having totally pure feet, clean feet. He was talking about having a relationship with God that covered him, and that relationship with God kept him at right with the people around him. And we already know that because of the fact that these guys couldn't find it. The guys that were against him could not find anything to accuse him of. So, how was the king's response to what Daniel said? Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he had trusted in his God. So the king was very pleased. Key, it's always nice to please the king. Okay, king was very pleased. And so they grabbed Daniel up out of the den, which means you didn't go in a door, you went down to get into this pit. And so they pulled him up out of the pit. That's what they'd put the stone over, that entrance. And Daniel came up, and when he came up, as he was brought out, of course the king wants to see how he did. Now, if it was like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, no smell of smoke was on them. Maybe there was no smell of cat on Daniel. Who knows? Like I said, this had to be a pretty rank little thing, and so who knows? He maybe came out smelling like a rose. But there was no injury at all because he had trusted in his God. Notice that's what it says specifically, because he had trusted in his God. There was no injury because he had trusted in his God. There was no injury because he had trusted in his God. I wonder how much we receive injury because of our trust levels. I'm not saying that every time something goes wrong in our life, it's because our trust isn't high enough, although, we're human beings and we struggle with things. But when it ties his trust level to the way that he had received no injury, that's confronting to me, because I look at that and I go, he had no injury because he had trusted in his God. Every day we have a choice to make. Okay, we all know that to be good citizens, we follow the orders and love our neighbor as ourselves, and we do what is necessary, social distancing and wearing masks. That's just a given because of where we find ourselves in our culture and what we do. However, there's a difference between following the orders out of concern for everyone around us and being afraid for ourselves. And that's something that we need to make sure we get taken care of between us and God. There's certainly wisdom on how we expose ourselves to certain things. Remember that when in the ancient world, when Christians were being persecuted, or and they were being killed by the Romans, the church fathers had to say, "Don't surrender yourself. Attempt to get away." Can you imagine? We're thinking like, this isn't even a question. If someone was saying, "Yes, I'm going to kill all the Christians in this town, next week Tuesday," I think there wouldn't really be a whole lot of Christians in that town next week Tuesday, don't you? Because we'd say, "I don't think that's a good thing." These guys would say, "Oh, here's a chance to die a martyr's death." And he'd be going, and so the church fathers, the leaders of the church had to say, no, don't do that. You talk about, they were saying, you don't test God on this stuff. You do take the precautions, like don't surrender yourself. And so we take precautions. We do the things that we think are wisdom and necessary. We ask God to show us what's right and what's to do. We have a reality in our lives, and our reality is we don't live in a world where we've seen every miracle we've ever prayed for come into existence. And so we have to use the wisdom that we have, and we have to do everything. And yet, knowing all of that, I'm still confronted by this. Because I think to myself, that guy had faith. That was amazing. Before the age of faith, right? I'm amazed by Daniel. No wonder he's listed in Hebrews 11 as one of the heroes of faith, because he had the faith to shut the mouth of lions. So, the king was pleased that he was alive, gave orders, got him out of there. They checked him out, no injury. And then the king gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. That's a grim verse, isn't it? It's just grim. It's like, ooh. Every once in a while when my children were much, much smaller, we'd say, "Let's have a family movie night." And one time I thought, well, I've never seen this one particular movie, and everyone says it's really good. I think we'll watch that. And all the kids were teenagers. I think Josh was probably the youngest at the time, maybe 12, and would have put Linnea at 14 and Alyssa a little older than that. And it was Empire of the Sun. And if you've never watched Empire of the Sun, we would watch Disney movies. We'd watch, all sorts of fun stuff. And so we watch Empire of the Sun, and I'm watching this movie with my kids, and we get to the end of this just heart-wrenching movie. And one of my daughters says, "I thought we were going to watch a happy movie." You wouldn't call Empire of the Sun a happy movie by any stretch of the imagination. And I haven't lived that one down since then. Of course, I'm the one that mostly brings it up because I think it's still funny about that hilarious misjudgment in my parenting skills, not having researched it quite as deeply as I should have. But anyway, this was not a happy verse. I mean, this would be a verse that if you were reading the story to your children, you might skip over, because it's a grim verse. It's just very grim. By the way, the king wasn't pleased with these guys. He was pleased that Daniel was alive. Remember how I told you as we started tonight that when you are playing politics at this high a level, and when you lie to the king, and when you force the king to murder his right-hand man, you better get the job done. Because the king's going to be pretty upset. All he needed was an excuse, and this was the excuse. But by the way, the excuse is easy. Hey, his God saved him because he's innocent. These guys must have been lying. They're done. And he was an Oriental despot, and so he just said, yeah, lions still need to be fed. We're going to throw the conspirators in. Probably one of the things that really disturbs us is it wasn't just the conspirators got tossed in. It was their wives and their kids and family, and that's disturbing. And of course, it should be disturbing. We're used to biblical jurisprudence. You do not punish the family of someone who has done something wrong, but we're not in Israel. We're in the Medo-Persian Empire. And when you're after a despot, you better take the despot out, because he's going to make sure you and your kids are never a problem. Why your kids? Because they grow up and they want to take revenge. And so despots just went, no problem. I'm going to make sure I don't have any problem generationally. If there's kids or grandkids, they're gone too. And so they wiped out the entire family line from that person down, because they didn't want to deal with it anymore. If you were unfortunate enough to be a close relative, you could have got taken out too, or at least put in the dungeon, because they were going to make sure they were taking care of this infection. These are powerful people. And so he wiped them all out. Now, that's immediately he wiped out the ones that were at hand, and obviously the rest of them were scattered around and ended up getting executed at some level. But the conspirators, they ended up being tossed in with their families, which is the most disturbing part to us. And it says, and this part is rather graphic, but it says that they were overpowered and crushed. The lions crushed all their bones, before they even reached the bottom. And I don't think it means reaching the bottom that they fell in. I think that they all kind of had to be pushed in, and that it was, some kind of incline, steep incline. So as they were sliding down the incline, they were getting picked off by the lions right away. And again, it doesn't take much to have your bones crushed by a lion, because they're big, nasty things. And you say, why is this very disturbing verse in there? Because there's a message, and the message is this: Daniel had divine protection. It wasn't a coincidence. The lions didn't have a sore tooth that day. The lions hadn't been fed and were not hungry. They were hungry. And when these conspirators were thrown into the lion's den, they were killed. That's why it's there. As gruesome as it is, it's to say there really was an angel down there helping Daniel, or he'd have been as dead as these folks were, because they trained these lions to kill people. And so this was a very bad end for the people that had decided they were jealous of Daniel's power. By the way, you understand their jealousy ended up with their death and the destruction of their families. And, I think in a lot of ways jealousy still does that today, but it's not so obvious so quickly. I think that when we get that very, very bad jealousy in us, where we don't want, not only are we jealous at someone succeeding, we actually want to put impediments to their succeeding in their way. When we start to fall in that trap, the problem is there is a God, and there is reaping and sowing. And I believe that we set impediments in our family's way because we train them in this same thing, and we can hurt our families in a big way. That's why it says, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, Exodus 34, but he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the fathers and the children to the third and fourth generation. That's not, and God punishes the fathers for their sin and the sons and the daughters for their sins, but the issue is that there is a training process. The sins are repeated in the family line because they're trained in it. It's nurture. They're trained to be involved in the same sins. And so God's got to deal with them. And it's really a promise. The promise is, I'm going to cut off this sin in the family line. That's God's promise. I can punish it for a couple generations, but I'm going to stop this sin in the family line so I don't have to punish it anymore. So anyway, these guys ended up very badly. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land. This is like Nebuchadnezzar doing this. May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Remember, Daniel was well known throughout all the kingdom. He had been the one that he was about to be elevated. Everyone knew Daniel, so they all knew that Daniel had gotten thrown into the lion's den. And so now the king says, hey, look what God did for Daniel. His God's amazing. And you need to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. No drinking out of his vessels. And his dominion will be forever. This is a really strong praise testimony from this man who had prophesied to Daniel. He will protect you. It wouldn't shock me if we see this guy before the throne one day. Now, I mean, he was an Oriental despot, which means he may have been, involved in all sorts of awful stuff that he never repented of, so maybe we won't see him there. However, we may. He had some very good I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Nebuchadnezzar there, especially at the end after he'd gone through his humbling process. And so, there's some interesting characters from history that we may see there. And so he just talks about the God being the one who rescues, and he rescued Daniel. And he pointed out that Daniel was the innocent one, again, who had been delivered from the power of the lions. Nebuchadnezzar, they were delivered, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been delivered from the flames of the furnace. So, chapter 6, verse 28, so this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Remember, Cyrus was the emperor. Darius was the one who was over there. And so Daniel had success. He had success in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He was one of God's vessels who was able to survive political intrigue. And that really is a message. God's ability to guide his servants through political turmoil. If you think about it, a lot of people died during this transition between Babylon and the Medes and the Persian Empire. But Daniel not only survived the transition, he was elevated. God's able to use his servants. We don't have to be afraid if there's political turmoil or things are going on. We don't have to be afraid. God's quite capable of helping his servants navigate the turmoil and be able to get into the positions that they're supposed to be in. That's his plan and his purpose. And so that's, by the way, a great comfort. When you understand that, you don't have to be involved in all of that evil political machination stuff where you're just back and forth and doing things. It's almost distasteful because God's people don't need to be involved in that political doublespeak. God's able to raise those that he needs to raise to the positions that he needs them in. And the key thing is, and this is where the politics goes, Daniel never allowed his position to go to his head. You can tell. When the position goes to your head, it means you make all sorts of mistakes. Pride goes before the fall, and you are compromising left and right to protect your position because the position becomes the most important. How do we know that Daniel never let it go to his head? Because he had it offered to him by Belshazzar, and he said, keep it, I don't need it. It wasn't important to him to have power. When it was offered to him by Belshazzar, he's like, no, I'm not interested. And that demonstrated that did not have a foothold in his heart. That's pretty powerful. He really was innocent before God and before the king. So, story of Daniel in the lion's den. I think there's a lot of eye-opening stuff in it. I think it's a reminder to us, even in the time that we're living right now, that we can live trusting in God. And the idea of living without injury is something I think that we need to meditate on. Trusting God to the level, because this is the one that confronted me the most of the thing tonight. And Daniel making the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11, and I'm thinking, that just really confronts me. And so I understand that there's some truth to the idea of trusting God And because of it, he suffered no injury. There's something in that I think that we can chew on for a while at least and come to grips with as individuals. And not being, that presumptuous thing, how that says, I can handle anything. That's the Christians in Rome saying, oh yes, I'll go out and surrender myself. I can handle it. No. It's something different than that. It's hearing the wisdom of God and his plans and understanding with full confidence that we can trust him every step of the way. I know, and when I say, I like how one of the radio commentators, Christian pastor, Steve Brown, he used to say this back when I was listening in the 90s to him on the radio. I don't even know he's on the radio anymore, but he used to say, he's Presbyterian and didn't believe the whole Presbyterian church he was a part of didn't believe God still spoke. And he'd say, I heard the Lord say to me, and then he'd say, well, I know, it sounded like God. And so I'm going to say that tonight in the message. I'm going to say, the Lord showed us once, it sounded like God. But he actually spoke to us once and he said, there will be times that you can't come out of your house. And he was saying that for the number of days that I tell you. And I understood right away that he was talking about some sort of pandemic, but he certainly wasn't talking about this one. Because this one you can come outside of your house. You can go to Publix. You can go to Walmart, for goodness sakes. You can go out and watch the Blue Angels and have people standing around you socially distanced. You can do different things. So this is not that time. But that's wisdom. That's even in the point of trusting God for no injury, that he'd instruct you how to avoid injury at times when you need to have that wisdom. I'm just throwing that out there as just one of those little wisdom things as we hear God and he shows us how to avoid injury too. So, Lord, thank you for Daniel and for the example he sets. I thank you that you, through his life, are able to show us how we can excel no matter the situation in which we find ourselves. And not only Daniel, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I ask that we would live up to their examples, Lord. We are certainly far more privileged than they are because we've got the Holy Spirit and the kingdom that they didn't have. Help us to carry that honor with great integrity. In your name I pray. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Hey, wanted to say good night to our streamers tonight. Thank you for being with us. Those of you on YouTube, you are the first ones who have a chance to be able to experiment with that platform tonight. And those of you on Facebook, I just wish you all a very good evening. And join us on Sunday morning. A few minutes before 10, we'll go live again. God bless. And for everyone in the room, Dawn, do you have anything?